Hey, CNFers. Look who's back. The Creative Nonfiction Podcast is sponsored by Scrivener. Scrivener was created by writers for writers. It brings all the tools you need to craft your first draft together in one handy app. Scrivener won't tell you how to write. It simply provides everything you need to start writing and keep writing. And if you enter the coupon code NONFICTION at checkout, you'll receive a 20% discount on your regular versions of Scrivener for macOS and Windows. That'll buy you some coffee to fuel that writing session, am I right? So whether you plot everything out first or plunge in, write and restructure later, Scrivener works your way.
Yeah, that's one of those lines that like I feel like that's one of like the truest things I've ever written.
That's Elisa Gabbert. I'm Brendan O'Mara, hey, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Huh. Welcome. How are you this week, fellow CNFer? I've missed you. How's it going? This is the show where I talk to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. Elisa returns to talk about her new book, The Unreality of Memory. It's published by FSG. Be sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcasts and keep the conversation going on social at CNFpod. I'm almost ready to get off the detox, but I'm developing my own social media manifesto, so I approach it with purpose and not mindless, data-mined zombie scrolling. You heard? Check out the show notes to this episode and others at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. And subscribe to the monthly reading list newsletter. Recommendations, advice, and what you might have missed from the world of this podcast. First of the month, no spam. Can't beat it. Also, you got a question? You can email the show, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, or consider leaving the show a voice message by heading over to BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, that's getting old. And pressing the appropriate button. We got a thing there in the right rail. It's also in the show notes as an embed. I'll answer your question on air. Play it on the air. That sounds pretty cool. I think so. So Elisa is at Elisa Gabbert on Twitter. It's very active there. And on this episode, we dig into her poetry and how it echoes in her prose. We talk about disasters, of course, and that ties into her essays. And a CNF Pod deep cut. I'm bringing back the bookshelf for the apocalypse. What's that? It's the 5 books Elisa would stash in her pack should the world fall into post-apocalyptic mayhem. So you have all that to look forward to. Stay tuned, of course, to the very end of the show for my parting shots. So without further ado, here is Elisa Gabbert. Huh. About suffering, which I thought was, just a really great one. And you open that poem like part of suffering is the useless urge to announce that you're suffering, and I just love that opening line. I think that segues nice into what you've written too.
Yeah, nobody ever asked me about my poetry. I don't know. Just doesn't feel like it's as often, I guess. Right. That poem actually I wrote right after finishing. I'm pretty sure this is true. The last essay that I wrote in the book. Well, that's not true. Not counting the epilogue, because I wrote the epilogue later on. But yeah, the last essay that I wrote in The Unreality of Memory was Sleep No More. So the one about, it kind of started off being about like insomnia and unconsciousness and anesthesia and pain. And when I finished it, I ended up thinking, oh, actually this essay is about suffering. That's what it's about. And then I had these like leftover notes and little scraps and things from my notes for that essay that I hadn't used that I wanted to use somehow. And I ended up writing that poem about suffering.
I find that really, really great because, I found this, in reading, which essay was it? I believe it was in Magnificent Desolation. It might have been something else, but you cited a writer that also used the word suffering in that essay. And I was just like, oh, that's kind of neat that the poems and the essays have these little grace notes. They're almost probably subconsciously, but they're kind of talking to each other. Do you find that's true when you're doing essays and poems, that sometimes you notice them bouncing off each other?
Yeah, and it's sort of unconscious. It's usually it starts unconscious and then it becomes conscious. Like the same phrases and lines and ideas just come to me all the time when I'm writing. And sometimes I have to just kind of, stop myself like, okay, Elisa, you already wrote that. You already wrote that multiple times. But often I'm like, well, that's one of my few profound thoughts, and I'm going to keep coming back to it over and over and over again. But I do consciously and purposely have bits of language that recur in like multiple different poems, or sometimes in a poem and also in an essay or across different books. And I always kind of wonder if people notice that or not, or if it's just like an Easter egg for myself.
Yeah, yeah, and I love the essay too that we taste nothing pure, not essay, poem, and it in that one in particular, it struck me as like a really like kind of cool tweet thread, and as someone who's kind of like very, active on Twitter, I was wondering like, does sometimes Twitter kind of inform the form your poems take sometimes?
So the poems I've been writing for the past few years, yeah, they started off as, I don't want to say they started off as tweets. That doesn't sound quite right. But basically, I would like get in the mood to write a poem, but I didn't know where to start. I was kind of trying to like either train myself or trick myself again into writing poems, because sometimes, months or even years will go by where I just like I'm just not kind of in the poetic mindset, and I have to figure out how to get into it again. And so one way that I was able to is I would just pick a word, or a phrase, like a little string of words. Sometimes it would be sort of a meaningful word like death or dying or pain, or suffering. And other times it would be kind of a meaningless string of words like I almost, or it's almost like, something like that. Because I noticed that I would sort of find, well, so sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I would use that phrase and then like search through my own tweets, trying to find, like good sentences that I had already written, at some point in the past 10 years, and posted on
Mhm.
Twitter. Um, and so, yeah, I started off doing that to kind of find like, oh, I've already written these like, 5 interesting sentences about death. So I'm going to curate them together in a way that it starts to sound like how I would write a poem. And then I can add more lines after that once I'm kind of in the rhythm of it. And then I noticed that if I picked like actually less interesting words, I would sort of get more interesting effects. Like if the repeating phrases were were almost just like incidental language. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, and so I was writing poems like that for a little while, like kind of doing this tweet curation thing. And sometimes I would kind of pull sentences from other sources of my own writing to fill it out. But then I got to a point where that method was failing me, because I would just keep finding the same tweets over and over again. And so for a little while I was like, well, this one can appear in 2 poems, that's fine. And then after a while I was like, okay, well, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of these phrases and this language, and I'm also like sick of searching through Twitter, because the search function is it's like kind of a crappy UX. But because I had sort of created this form, I just started composing poems in that manner, but of completely new lines and thoughts. Like I would just sort of start with like an in stop sentence, and then heartbreak, and then another in stop sentence that's like sort of related but not quite. So it became trying to recreate the pattern, like the pattern of curation, but I wasn't curating anymore, of just trying to sort of diverge in a new direction, but not entirely, or like repeating an unexpected part of the previous line, things like that. Yeah, so if it sounded like tweets, you're right on. There's a reason for that. I think like often my tweets do have the kind of same voice as like lines in my poems.
And you talked about your poetic mindset, and and I suspect that you have an essayistic mindset too, or at least hats you wear at a given time. How do you navigate each of those mindsets, or travel between the two?
Yeah, I think they are on a continuum. It's just like easier for me to live on the prose side, actually. I think my mind naturally thinks in sentences. And so, like, for example, if I'm reading a book and it's making me think a lot, and I feel like I want to write about it, like I'll just start thinking in sentences. Like I'll start describing the book to myself in sentences, and I'll feel like I need to make notes about it. And so that's just sort of like my natural way of being. And if I want to write about something in prose in an essay, I can do it. I can just like sit down and produce. But poetry is much harder. It's like you have to be in the right mood, and yeah, it's not something I can always just make myself do. And often it's like right now I've gotten into the habit a little bit where I found a form that like I can make myself write usually a poem a week. I'm on like a good couple of month run where I'm writing a poem a week, sometimes two, sometimes I skip a week. But like it's partly like forming that habit, and kind of committing to it, and like figuring out ways to make myself think like a poet. Like going for a walk makes me think like a poet, more so than it makes me think like an essayist for some reason. So if I'm stuck, like I'll go for a walk. And also like reading poetry helps me write poetry in a way that like I don't really need to read essays to like get in the mood to remember what it's like to write an essay. So yeah, it is sort of this continuum, because I think, especially lately, like my poems feel very essayistic. I don't really think that my essays feel that poetic, but I don't know. Other people may disagree.
Yeah. I know with your first essay collection, you didn't know at the time that you were writing a collection. You had a lot of essays, and you were kind of like a ball of elastics, and it kind of added up. Did this latest book feel like you were starting with an essay collection, and then you sort of backfilled it?
Yeah, this was different because I got it in my mind that I wanted to try to actually sell a book of essays, as opposed to just, kind of cobbling it together. So I wrote a book proposal, and that forced me to kind of imagine, well, what would the finished collection look like? It was the first time I've ever written a book proposal. It was definitely tricky and like a little unnatural for me, but I figured it out.
Yeah, lots of fun to write.
Yeah, so I had to figure out a way to make it sound like I mean I had a few essays that were, some were sort of related, but some were like not as obviously related. So I had to figure out a way to make it sound like, well, this will eventually be a cohesive collection. And I did believe it would eventually feel like a cohesive collection, but it was hard for me to see how when it wasn't written yet. So there was definitely some faking it involved in that process. Do you know the writer Matthew Salas? He has a novel like just out. We had the same launch date, and he
no.
Oh, he's great. He writes a lot of great like craft essays and critical essays as well. I think he has a book of craft essays coming out next year from Catapult. He's awesome. You should read his work. I'll send you some links. But
yeah, please.
We went to grad school together, and the first essay in the Unreality of Memory, Magnificent Desolation, when that was published, I remember him telling me like, oh, I would read a book of these. And I guess I just kind of thought about that, like, oh, well, I wonder if these could be a book somehow. And then, I wrote a couple more that were sort of in the same vein. And that's when it started coming together. But I also was writing like, the essays in the second section are pretty different. Like you could almost see them being two completely different collections in a way, like each twice as long. But I don't know, I guess, as a poet, as somebody who tends to write really short books, like I get sick of things. So I'm glad I was able to kind of make them work in one collection. But yeah, it was different because there were a few things I was writing at the time where it was, it was just very obvious, like that wouldn't fit in this book. So I had to make choices along those lines.
Yeah, I've grown to really love the last few years, the essay collection and I view it as like a good album of music where it's all the things are thematically tied. It's great to go from track 1 to track 9, or you can just listen. You could listen to it on shuffle. They're all bound by some theme, but you can pull one off the wall. I just kind of love the idea of you can experience the whole or just part of it, and that's what I kind of love about yours too. It can kind of just go plug in, plug out, or read it cover to cover.
Yeah, I wanted to arrange this book. I mean, I guess the thing is, if you're expecting some readers will read it however they want, I guess it doesn't matter how you arrange it. I just, I remember having the conversation with my editor where there was one sequence that there's an effect where like you sort of learn something twice. And I sort of don't acknowledge the second time that it's something I've already said. And I'm like, yeah, that's not ideal. But in the first section, I wrote those essays, I think closer together in time, and it was just like I kept going to the same source material. And then when I put them together, like I noticed sort of, how much overlap there was. And I was like, oh, but I kind of like that. And then but I did have to dial it back because there was a little bit too much in my first draft. But yeah, I think the order of a collection it's something that really interesting to me. I think about it a lot. Like I really sort of agonized over the first essay in this collection because I was like, I felt really sure that Magnificent Desolation should be the first essay because I feel like it just kind of serves like an introduction for the book that sort of explains like how I got obsessed with disasters. Yeah, and it just seemed to make the most sense to me. It felt like the most introductory. But it was also it was not the first, but it was the second essay that I wrote, like in terms of just chronological order. I wrote it in late 2016 because I remember I'd been like kind of noodling on it, and then I really started working on it in earnest right after the election. And so like now it feels like one of the weakest to me in a way, because like I don't know, I didn't really know what I was doing. Like I hadn't thought of the collection as something that was going to exist yet. And I hadn't sort of come up with like a process for writing the essays. Like eventually by the end, it was almost like I can do this like clockwork. Like they all have like sort of similar structures. And like I sort of followed a similar process. But yeah, with that one, it was just like, I was just sort of totally making it up as I went. And so now like it feels so sloppy to me, but there's also something like kind of great about it because it's sloppy. You know what I mean? That I didn't want to, I didn't want to try to rewrite it completely and revise that away, because there were some things about it that like, not only would I not do now, like, I don't think I could do now because I've like
what?
Like I think just, like almost just changing the subject very rapidly, in this almost like distracted way, which that's an effect I really like. And like, it's something that I always kind of try to achieve between paragraphs, is like a little bit of a leap that like is slightly unexpected. Like it's not completely veering off, but it's a little bit of a leap. But I think some of the, the transitions or non-transitions and this essay are like, they just feel so weird to me. Like I'm like, I'm just impressed that I thought that was okay. It's hard to even explain. It's just, it just felt very like, so untrained and intuitive. And I was like surprised that people liked it. And then I was like, oh yeah, no, I guess I like that too. But then after a while I was like, well, I can see the things I was trying that then I like started repeating too much in other essays. You know what I mean? Like it just, it both annoys me. Like I want to edit it, but I can't ever figure out how to edit it without ruining what's good about it. And so that's why I was like, this feels like a scary essay to put first because people might really hate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine that's kind of like musicians who might as they get more, more skilled or more sort of technically proficient, or they learn something new, they almost want to like go back to that thing that like, oh, this was so raw and animalistic, but I've got this new technique and I think I could make it cleaner and tighter. But at the same time, what makes it kind of punk rockish and live and improvisational is what makes it so good. So you don't want to edit out and iron out those wrinkles, right?
Yeah. And I really kind of like reading like the first books of authors who like later became sort of much more famous and like, started winning a lot of prizes. And like, when you get to that point where people are like, oh, this is the book to read, or like, that's the book that won all the awards or whatever. But actually going back and like reading their first book is often so interesting because it has like, signs of their genius and there's something really brilliant about it, but it's also like sloppy and unresolved and like what I love is when something feels like unfixable. Like it's not like you're like, oh, I can see how this should have been edited or changed or saved to like make it, feel like really good and polished and done. But it's more just like the error is just so inherent to the thing that like you really can't fix it. Like I'm thinking of Kazuo Ishiguro's first novel. Have you ever read that?
Mm-mm. What's the name of it?
It's called A Pale View of Hills. It's like, it's, far from his most famous book. It's really weird. And like people, I blogged about it once years ago. And like, there's so many comments on that blog post, like for years and years and years, it kept getting comments because people would come with like their own interpretation of the book. Like, and it's unresolvable. Like it's endlessly interpretable because it just like basically doesn't make sense. Like you can't solve the problem. But yeah, I kind of like when things are flawed in that way, where it's like an unfixable flaw. Because I was just thinking about it yesterday. Donna Tartt's first novel, The Secret History, which is like, very, messy and wrong in many ways, but just like you get so swept up in it. And like there's parts of that book that I read it almost 20 years ago, and I just remember them so well. Like I remember the way it made me feel to read them. Even though the book kind of, ultimately sort of fails in this way. Like I think if I read it now, I would just completely roll my eyes and not finish it.
Yeah. Well, you're a different reader and a different writer 20 years, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in a book about disasters, by and large, that you've written, how does memory, or to borrow the title, the unreality of memory, fit in to what you were trying to pull off in this book?
I mean, I guess it's so sort of belabored and, just like everybody knows that memories are unreliable. And yeah, I really, it drives me a little nuts. It's sort of funny, but every now and then people get the title of my book wrong. Like I'll see it written out and they've written The Unreliability of Memory. I'm like, oh, that's not what it's called. That feels like, of course I cursed myself to have people get my book title wrong, given what it is named. But yeah, I mean, so that would be a terrible name for a book, I think. And of course, the unreliability of memory is like part of that, but unreality is like so much more. Like memory literally isn't real, like I don't know. To me, that's a lot more profound.
It's a word I have to roll over in my head like 20 times before it kind of like before I get it. It's weird. It's like I have to just keep turning the wheel. I don't know.
Well, it's one of those funny words that you could break two ways because it's like unreal dash a T,
Mhm.
or like undash reality. Um, and yeah, I think it's one of those words that's like always both.
Yeah, it's like undash reality is kind of like undoing reality, or is like, and then there's the unreal component, which is just in the parlance of the vernacular. It's just like, that's
Uh-huh.
unreal. Are you kidding me? And so,
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's just this word that kind of just, like I said, it just kind of ping pongs between my ears, and it's just like, well, all right, what's going on here?
Yeah. Now, I always thought of it as like a very uncommon word, and now I see it all the time. Like I'm constantly seeing it in books that I read, like especially older books. I think it was in more like common usage in the 20th century. But anyway,
Hmm.
so what I was like, kind of most fascinated by, like sort of like horror fascinated by, was just failures of kind of cultural and collective memory in terms of like I couldn't believe that we were repeating the past so soon. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
like of course it's one of like the lessons of history that history repeats itself, and that um, these great disasters will occur over and over again. But like it still shocked me that like like it hadn't even been a century since the Holocaust, and like for all the never again rhetoric, like you could just see like fascism is encroaching. Like why can't we stop it? What, like
Yeah.
why don't why don't people seem to be as horrified by this as they should be? Why are we not doing everything in our power at every moment to dismantle these migrant camps on the border? Like,
I've got that. When you cited the writer who said crises get boring before they get better, I parenthetically put kids in cages. Like that hasn't
yeah,
gone away. It just got
yeah,
boring.
yeah. And like, I mean, I think it's also just not knowing what to do, just like feeling so helpless that it like just naturally turns into apathy in a way.
And then so we look at our phones and just kind of numb out.
Right. And I think maybe it's also distance. Like it's just very abstract if you don't actually live near there and you're not seeing it. Um, and you're definitely not seeing it on the news or in the newspaper anymore. So it's just hard to keep that like present in your mind, especially when there's so much other horrible stuff kind of competing for your attention as well. Um, but yeah, it just it and the way that kind of cultural memories or just history, like I was thinking about the kind of line between like history and memory. Um, just like why does it recede so quickly? Why do we like how can we disagree on these things? you
Yeah.
know so I guess that was the connection for me with like what's happening now sort of politically, and of course with climate change, just trying to understand why we keep not stopping it. Like in fact it just keeps getting worse, and it's like awareness is not the problem. Like everybody's aware of it now, like everybody, even like even like the most sort of hard right Republicans at this point, like it seems to me like even they may be denying in public, but it seems to me like in their heart of hearts they know it's happening, and the only way like we're the only ones that can stop it. We're all responsible, all of us who are alive now. Like but and yet like it's like we went so quickly from um to sort of there's plenty of time, like maybe the next generation will worry about that till it's just like, oh wait, well now it's just too late, it's too late, so we might as well just sort of
Well,
have our little bacchanalia.
yeah. Well, it's that to that point. You cite that writer who's basically the what we're experiencing now is a result of the carbon emitted into the air 40 years ago. And like
Yeah. Oh
when that
God.
hits you in the face, it's just like, well, what's gonna happen 40 years from now when we've been really pumping this shit into the atmosphere? Like
I
we're so
know.
hosed. We're
I
so screwed.
know. I
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
Yeah.
we'd rather probably invest in rockets to go ruin another planet because it just feels it's all gone to shit.
Yeah. It's difficult to take in.
And then like you also, you cite a writer too that, like, oh, we have to, change our actions, but this we is like it is like pardoning the real villains here who have known about this bullshit for so long but are addicted to it and make so much money and profit off it that it's kind of like, it's like shaming the consumer for the stuff that they've been giving us, and then we've as a result just totally fucked the planet.
Oh yeah. I just read a story last week or earlier this week. It was going around. It was basically about how like the whole idea of plastic recycling was just a huge scam. like, like you actually can't really recycle plastic. Like a very small amount of it can you actually recycle. Just the like everybody throwing their plastic containers in the recycling all the time is like basically a huge sham because it's so much more expensive to recycle than it is to just make more plastic. So they don't really do it.
Ugh. Let's see. There's something you said. I don't think it's not in the book, but I think I read this in an interview where you said something that a piece should have internal resonances, which could occur at the level of the word or the phrase or the idea or even the implication that works semantically like slant rhymes, parts that call back softly to other parts that make a chime in your mind. And I loved what you said there. And I was wondering if maybe you could unpack that a little bit and maybe how you try to have internal resonances in your own work.
I remember that interview. I think it was somebody asking me for like, what's the best writing advice you've ever gotten? and
Yeah, that's what it's from. Yeah.
yeah, and that that's very specific, sort of like craft advice. I feel like usually people are looking for something more philosophical when they ask that question. But
People dig craft on this show. So.
Yeah. And I think I heard from my thesis advisor, John Scoyles, after he saw that interview, and I think I got the words wrong because I think I said disconsolate and chocolate. Like if you use the word, I can't remember which came first, but the thing that he said was like, oh, if you use the word disconsolate in a poem, then later in the poem you should also use the word chocolate. And I can't remember maybe desolate was the word that he had said, but I actually like disconsolate better. But yeah, so the idea was like, not that this should be like end rhymed in like an A B fashion necessarily, just that it's somewhere in the poem, like reminding you heard that other word, like a distant memory of a rhyme. And I love that kind of effect in poetry. So, you can kind of create it in that same sonic way in a piece of prose, like from one sentence to the next. And I like when that happens, and, it can kind of seem like almost accidental, but it's on purpose. But I also, yeah, I try to do that kind of like across the longer scale of an essay with images sometimes, like images that sort of echo each other, or just, sometimes just very explicitly like, oh, that reminds me again of that thing I was talking about earlier. And so the one example I can think of in Unreality is in that long essay about like witches and hysteria and mass hysteria. There's a part where I think it's the very first section is about sort of like quote unquote classical hysteria, like this French disease that people believed for a while really existed, where a woman would like contort and do all this mad stuff, and they would have to be locked up in a hospital. And one of the like quote unquote symptoms was called la belle indifférence, like just the beautiful flatness, which was that like they were very indifferent to their own disease, I guess. And so then, later I'm kind of traveling through history where I'm talking about witches in the Middle Ages, but also like all these different kind of quote unquote psychosomatic conditions that have existed in different cultures. And there was, I believe it's in reference to these girls who seem to be catching like a Tourette's like syndrome from each other. And, they often had that same, kind of like indifference speaking about themselves. And so, I just use that phrase again, like, and I feel like, it comes far enough along in the essay that she's sort of forgotten it the first time. And so, I hope it's not like sort of beating you over the head with it when it's repeated, but just that kind of like, just reminder. Yeah. I'd forgotten that I said chime, but like, it's like a little ding of recognition that you're sort of sounding.
Oh, yeah. For sure. That's kind of like exactly like, and it's like this little grace note. You're like, where did I hear that before? And it just feels like, cohesive in a way that doesn't feel like, overworked or, like gluten in bread or something. It's like, yeah, it feels, it feels natural.
Yeah. I think the way John Scoyles, the poet who told me about that, described it in a poem was sort of like that the poem is a spider web, and if you touch one part, like the whole web quivers. Mm-hmm. And so it's like there's just sort of all these very like subtle little connections threaded through, ideally.
I love in one part, I believe it's in the opening essay, where you write, I have a strange instinctual desire for things to get even worse. I think a terrible outcome and then wish for it. And what outcomes or what disasters have happened or have not happened that could happen that maybe you wish for in some sort of perverse way so you can watch it from a distance, maybe?
God,
I kind of feel this way about the big one, the earthquake in the subduction zone, because I'm right on the edge.
There, that's so scary.
Yeah, I don't want it to happen, but at the same time, I'm like weirdly fascinated by it too.
Oh God, yeah. I think my thing is sort of, yeah. That's one of those lines that like I feel like that's one of like the truest things I've ever written. Which it's about me, so it shouldn't be that hard to write true things about me. But it was just like a very crisp realization that I was like, oh yeah, I do this. I think it's more about like sort of personal things, like rather than live in uncertainty. I kind of just like want my life to be ruined. Because like uncertainty, like living between sort of hope and grief is so unbearable sometimes. But I do think like, it's like the Sontag epigraph at the beginning that that people have this weird kind of appetite and desire for disaster and apocalypse, and I think that's something that's sort of happening at this cultural level, where like the uncertainty is unbearable. Like right now, like not knowing when these conditions of living with this pandemic will end, and just kind of wishing like we just get struck by a comet, like put us out of our misery, But yeah, it's like, I mean, I totally recognize it as perverse. Like I can't remember if I've said this, if I say this anywhere in the book. I know I've written it somewhere, maybe it's in a poem or something, but sometimes when I hear bad news, I like involuntarily smile, which is super fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to like hide my face because I'm like, why am I doing this? Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
It's some kind of reaction of like, well, I think it's kind of related to, how like when something just makes you really happy or delighted, you cry. And so it's like I associate crying mostly with like being sad. But sometimes just like this bubbling up of any strong emotion will make you cry, joy or even just kind of surprise. So I think it's like a really intense discomfort that just like somehow my wires get crossed, and and it makes me smile.
Mm.
But like I know it's wrong. Like it feels absolutely wrong and bad, but it's almost like you can't I don't know, it's not very natural to like grimace. Which is like
Right,
what
right.
you think would be the expression that you would make. It's almost like, just turning the corners of your mouth up is a little bit more natural, like a default reaction to anything. Um, so yeah, I think it's just my brain misfiring.
All right, so I primed the pump for you the other day about the bookshelf for the apocalypse, and I think that's very fitting and germane, given disaster essays, if you
Yes.
will, that we are on the brink of something bad. But if you have a pack, you might be able to throw in 3 to 5 books. So I wonder what those books would be for you, Elisa.
So I interpreted this. I hope this is how you meant it. Like these are the books for me to read while I'm
Yeah,
in my bomb
something for
shelter
like
or whatever. And like it's not
yeah,
like I'm saving these 5 books for the future of civilization. Hope.
exactly. It's just for your own entertainment.
Okay,
These are the books that
good.
have meant so much to you that they are worth taking up space in your post-apocalyptic backpack.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I don't want that responsibility of like, forming the canon for like the 20 people who survive.
Yeah, like a Noah's Ark or something.
Yeah,
Here are
yeah,
these
yeah.
two. Book, yeah.
Or like at the end of Fahrenheit 451, when like all the men are sitting around the fire, like reciting the passages of the books they remember. Um, so my inclination is actually to like mostly go with books that I either haven't read yet or that I haven't fully read, that I haven't completely read. So number one pick, absolutely Moby Dick, because like I'm like waiting for some kind of life circumstance to give me like the immersive Moby Dick experience that I want to have, and that I don't feel like I can have it with like this setup of my life now. So I'm gonna bring Moby Dick. Oh, yeah, that gives me an idea for because I have kind of a wild card book at the end. I hadn't quite decided yet. Okay, so yeah, and this might be cheating, but I also really want to bring some like collecteds because like yeah, is that cheating? I don't think so. So
No,
I would
no.
bring I mean there's those great Library of America volumes. Um and I really want to bring some Ashbery and some Sontag. Unfortunately, both of their work is split across at least 2 volumes, but I think for the reasons I touched on earlier, I would go with the first Ashbery collected and the first Sontag essays collected, the first 2 volumes of each of those, because I like early work. It's like
Mm-hmm.
I like that it's a little messier. So I've got those, and
Okay.
I haven't read either of those in full, so I'd be leaving lots of treats for myself.
I'm surprised that you're going with some things that you might not end up liking in the end.
No, but
That
I
you'd be
know
like,
I will. I know I will. I'm like,
okay,
I mean, I know I love, like, you can just open to any page of Ashbery and it's good. And you can open to any page of Sontag and it's good. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So, and there's no way I wouldn't like Moby Dick, because every time I've ever read part of Moby Dick, I've loved it. I just haven't read the whole thing.
cool. All right,
Um,
got a couple more.
yeah. So then, I really want something that's almost like a reference text. So I think I would take the collected journals of Sylvia Plath, not her poems, but her journals, just because that would be like so intimate. And there's just a lot in them, and there's this great index, and it kind of, I feel like it feels sort of infinite in a way, like just anything that you can think of, you can like look up in the index, and she wrote something about everything. Like
Yeah,
she wrote something about Marilyn Monroe one time. And so I think I would really enjoy that, and it would feel like I was never getting to the end of it. So that's 4, right? Have one more.
that's 4. Give me one
Okay.
more.
Yeah. So when I said Moby Dick, I was thinking maybe I should bring some Proust, but that's really more than one book. So no, I think for my 5th book, I'm going to just bring actually like a comfort novel that I know I love. And it's like it would change on any given day, but today I'm going to say Howard's End.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, Elisa Gabbert, in my opinion, you're a certifiable badass. So thank you for coming on the podcast and talking shop. This is a blast as always, and continued success with the book. And thank you for the book.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading it and for having me again.
Thank you, cherished friend, for listening to the show, for being a part of this community. And thanks, of course, to Elisa for coming back on the show. Thanks to Scrivener also, but of course, Elisa. It's always nice when they come back. I'm not sure she had a good time. It's hard for me to tell. I think she might think I'm a moron. I don't know. It's my own hang-up, but whatever. She's wicked smart. Me, whatever. Not so much. I thought that was bananas that her bookshelf for the apocalypse included a title she had never read in fall. Didn't see that coming. All those are in the show notes to check out. All I know is that I loved hearing her work through her process and the internal resonances of her poetry and her prose. I mean, that sounds sort of academic, and you know me, bruh. I'm like the street urchin of CNF, just a gutter punk CNFer. That's me, baby. Yeah, I finished the retype. Is that burying the lead? A little bit. I did it in an Adderall-induced bout of manic writing. I did over 30,000 words over the weekend, and I got it done. Holy shit, man. Oh, yeah. I'm taking Adderall, too. 40 years old and taking meds that they give to, like, hyper 7-year-olds. Anyway, seems to be helping. I don't know. Maybe not. My mood seems to be better at the very least. I'm not super jittery. I don't even know. My mind is still a bit fractured, but here we are. Now it's on to the copy editing stage, of course. Then I'll send it to a paid copy editor. So I'm going to do my copy edit, then to a paid copy editor, and then off to the big editor. The big editor. Oh, I hope I'm in the red zone, man. I gotta be. My nightmare is that I might have to punt. 70% of me thinks it's good. 29% is terrified that it's unsalvageable. 1% of me is dead. I'm only 99% whole. I gave up the sauce for a bit, as some of you might know. So there's no celebrating with booze per se, but I found a delicious non-alcoholic IPA by Athletic Brewing. I cracked one of those open a few weeks ago. It's helping me stay sort of on the wagon while celebrating the accomplishment. And you should celebrate your own accomplishments too. That's kind of the point why I'm bringing this up. If you finish something, submit something, take the time to give yourself some credit. I mean it. This shit will beat you down, but it's okay. I'm here to tell you it's okay. That's not tongue-in-cheek. I'm here for you, okay? Celebrate when you finish something. People don't finish things anymore because it's hard. You get to that messy middle, that boring ass part, and it's just like where it feels like garbage. You feel like garbage. Your self-worth is tied to this thing. And the ones that finish, those are the pros. And you're a pro. I know you are. So celebrate. Even if it gets rejected, celebrate that you put it out there. Take a moment and appreciate it. Little audio mag update. I got 3 of them recorded. It's so cool to see how they came in printed, sent them back. We went through a bunch of edits and seeing how they manifested themselves in audio. I have to track them with a little bit of music, but it's really neat to see how they've transformed, and it's going to be real exciting. It's going to be pretty damn cool. So I've got 3 recorded, 1 about to record, and 1 writer dragging his goddamn ass. So I hope to perhaps maybe publish this in October, maybe. We'll see. It's quite the journey, man. What else? Is that it? Oh, wait, one more thing. If you're playing golf, you might want to hire a caddy, right? Not just to carry your clubs, but to give you a little guidance. Read the curves of the green you might be missing, am I right? Same for your writing. If you're ready to level up, I'd be honored to serve you in your work. video calls, transcripts of the call, so you can refer to it as notes. It's pretty rad. Detailed critiques, email correspondence, and that person carrying your bag for you so you can focus on the work. Email me and we'll get started. creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com or brendan@brendano'mara.com. Hey, that sound good? Okay. Well, if there's anything I know in this crazy world, as the smoke lifts, if you can do, interview. See ya.